Hello, students. This lecture covers the introduction to Gary Jackson's Missing You Metropolis, which is our book of collected poems for unit number 2. Here is our author, Gary Jackson. He was born in Topeka, Kansas. He's an assistant professor of poetry and won an award in 2013 for a sort of new voice in American poetry. So, as you read Gary Jackson's poems, you will find poems dealing with two major types. You will find poems that deal with the comic book world, where superheroes represent real world issues and concerns. About these groups of superhero poems, Gary Jackson says this: I wouldn't say comics are the equivalent of my whole life. They just serve a pretty damn good vehicle for me to explore the usual suspects: sex, race, loss, death, navigating the world and my place in it. And I think that's what comics have always done for the people who create them. So one group of poems will deal with superheroes and the world of comic books that Gary Jackson will use to navigate real world concerns of sex, race, loss, and death. The next major group of poems you will read from Gary Jackson are biographical poems about growing up. These will be the focus on the narrator's life and the narrator's friend Stuart. These biographical poems will often have real world moments from Jackson's life. However, do not think of these poems as being a true biography. Here's what Jackson says about the poems he's written about his own personal history. There's no doubt that by writing a poem, I've revised my own memory of what I've experienced, though sometimes I get interested in the process of reconstruction, and I end up writing about how that happens. And other times, I straight up lie. So, what Jackson is telling you in this quote is that as you read the poems about his life, his friend Stuart, growing up in Kansas, you will see that he is reconstructing true events, but he will twist those events to make sure that they are good poems. It's not just about reconstructing the truth, it's about creating a good piece of fiction, of art. So, as we focus on the poems of Jackson, there are two main groups: superhero poems and poems about his biographic history. Let's take a brief aside and look at the notion of superheroes in general. Jackson's poems deal with comic book and superheroes as symbols and metaphors for issues that exist in society. He uses superheroes as metaphors to allow authors, especially Jackson, to highlight certain aspects of society that people want to ignore or downplay. Superheroes are exaggerated characters, so connecting them to real world issues exaggerates and highlights those issues. Jackson is essentially will use these superheroes and comic book characters to talk about real world issues in an exaggerated and fantastic way to allow you to think about how those superheroes can act as metaphors for issues in our society. That would be the use of those metaphors and superheroes as theme. Now, superheroes themselves have always been symbols and metaphors for real world issues. We have examples like Green Lantern trying to address the inability to help structural racial issues, a concern very present in today's climate. We've seen Iron Man be used to talk about how the superhero persona can be an addiction and have the same effects as other types of addiction, like alcoholism. We've seen characters like the X-Men be used to draw attention to the way that bigotry and discrimination works against minorities. And we've seen, most recently, characters of Thor to address issues of gender and gender roles. So Jackson uses superheroes in the same way that comic books have always used them, They are the artistic medium uh, to transmit his message. As you read the poems of Jackson's book, which you can find on Blackboard, pay attention to which poems deal with Jackson's autobiographical story and which deal with superheroes. Pay attention to how they approach different topics. Pay attention to how they approach the same topics. If you're not familiar with the superhero, don't worry, you can Google them. But remember, it's not a poem about the superhero. It's a poem about how that superhero is a metaphor for a real world issue. So, let's read Jackson's first poem. Please go ahead, pause this video, and read the first poem in the Poetry 1 section on Blackboard. It will be The Secret Art of Reading Comics after Auden. Pause the video and come back after you have read the material on Blackboard. All right, welcome back. Before we need to break any poem down, we need to summarize the plot of a poem and try and think about what our thoughts are before we start to try and understand what the theme of the poem might be. So, look at the title. Take a moment, write down your response to the title of this poem. What about, if anything, puzzles you? In your words, what do you think the title of the poem you just read means? Does it remind you of anything? Watch the video introducing poetry if you need a reminder. Look at the contents of stanza 1. In your own words, try to summarize what is happening. Try and do the same act for stanza 2. Summarize in your own words what you feel is happening. Now try stanza 3. Summarize in your own words what is happening. Now try stanza 4. Consider the narrator of the poem. Right? Remember, the person speaking the words may not necessarily be the narrator. Let me ask you a question. Do you know anything about the narrator of Jackson's first poem? Do we have an unnamed narrator? What do you think? So, we do have an unknown narrator, but look over the language and words used by our unnamed narrator. What are things that we know about our narrator? Write down what you feel you can understand about who the narrator might be in terms of their personality and their knowledge. So, we have a narrator who's knowledgeable about comics, speaks directly to you, the reader, and is willing to share the secret of reading the comics to you. Setting. Setting is where and when a poem takes place. As we said in Jackson, there might be two types of poems. Poems that take place in our real world, in Jackson's history, and poems that take place in a comic book world. For the first poem, do we know where we are? We don't really. We are existing in the mind of our unnamed narrator. We have no discernible abilities to say what world we are in, except in the mind of our narrator. So, is the narrator describing a real-world event, or is the narrator talking about comic book history? Try and find examples to prove your response. So, you may not have known this, but the narrator of Gary Jackson's first poem, A Secret Art of Reading Comics, is talking about a very famous comic event from Avengers number 4. We have some proof of this. They talk about how every move is in white bubbles. We see the thwack in red letters, and we talk about the action between the panel's gutters. Gutters is a comic book term for the space in between the boxes of pictures. So, here is a copy of the cover of Avengers number 4, the comic book about which Jackson's poem is talking. Now, let's look at diction, imagery, and metaphor. Right? This is how the words Jackson uses in this poem helps to create a tone and impression as a way to convey an idea. He uses imagery and metaphor to, to help you understand his theme about reading comics. So, what this comic deals with is the moment in Avengers number 4, pictured here, when the Avengers find Captain America frozen in the ice and find that he is fine, that he will live to be a hero another day. But that's not the key moment of the poem. The key moment happens in the last stanza. So, our narrator tells us that the secret art to reading a comic is to see how the action between the panel's gutter bleeds into our own world. So the last bit of the poem, the last stanza in the first poem of Jackson's book, undercuts the feeling of the comic book world to show you the secret that exists in comic books, the secret behind the panels. This secret is that Captain America is shown as weak and helpless, unable to save his friend Bucky. The world ignores Captain America, whose body, wrapped in the American flag, falls into the water. This turn of phrase, body wrapped in the American flag, is when Jackson evokes the casualties of American soldiers. American soldiers who have died in combat return home in coffins wrapped in a U.S. flag. But oftentimes we are not shown those bodies, just like we are not shown this image of Captain America, this helpless and fragmented image of a man who is a casualty of war. Instead, we see the hero. We see the perfect soldier who will return handsome and in perfect shape, as opposed to the bodies wrapped in the American flag. So the theme of this poem is that the secret art of reading comics can show us how comic book art can tell us about our society. And what Avengers number 4, as a bit of comic book art, should tell the reader is that heroism always comes at a cost, and that war heroes like Captain America always are joined by bodies wrapped in the American flag, that there is always a cost to the heroism. So in stanza 4, we see this. We see the cost displayed to you to ask yourself that the secret art of Avengers number 4 as a comic book is really about the cost of war.